Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So WandaVision has finally reached its end. We finally saw the season finale of the first ever series made by Marvel for Disney Plus, and it will directly tie into the movies in a way that we have never seen before. So the stakes were very much high for this series, which means a lot of people had a lot to say about the season finale. Now, I for one have already shared my thoughts on the season finale as well as my thoughts on the overall show in my review, which will be available on my channel by the time that you're watching this, so you can go ahead and check that out. But I did want to make a separate video on top of my review discussing why people were somewhat disappointed, at the very least, to throwing their laptops across the room at the very most at the season finale of the series. And the main reason why that was the case was because of the theories, the speculation that just got out of hand as the episodes were released on a weekly basis. And we're going to be diving into all of these theories that were around that we heard around the grapevine. So we're going to be discussing all of that in this video. But before we dive into my thoughts on all of this, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. And don't forget to share your thoughts down below on why it is that so many people were so disappointed to see that their theories and their predictions fell through for the show. So we're not even going to beat around the bush, okay? We're not even going to go around in circles. We're getting straight to the point here. We're going straight for the big one. The first theory that we're going to be discussing for this video is the involvement of Mephisto. If you didn't know who Mephisto was before this series started, you certainly know who he is now. With the way that people were mentioning him here, there, everywhere, you would think that Mephisto was written on the back of their hands. By the time that the series was over, everyone knew this obscure character from the comics. Now, the main idea surrounding Mephisto's involvement was that someone had to be behind the hex. Someone had to be behind the curtains, controlling Wanda, forcing her to stay within the hex so that they could get something out of her, most likely her powers. And one of the prevailing theories surrounding this was, of course, the involvement of Mephisto, who is the literal devil in the Marvel comics. Now, this very much makes sense in the context of the comics because Wanda and Mephisto have crossed paths in the comics several times. And in fact, in the comics, during the similar House of M storyline, you see that Wanda does actually have these children that have been manifested, instead of from just her magic as is in the show, have actually been manifested from parts of Mephisto's soul somehow. Basically, they're like Horcruxes in the comics, okay? Billy and Tommy are parts of Mephisto's soul, parts of his entity, and they can therefore be used to bring him back to life, like bring him to their plane of existence. So that's one of the reasons why people did believe that his involvement would be explored in the series, because it makes sense when you think of the context of the comics and the House of M storyline. It also very much made sense because pretty much from the get-go, people knew that Agatha Harkness would be involved in this series, and so with the reveal of that character's involvement, people thought it would only be logical for Mephisto to also be involved because the two have also partnered up in the comics previously. So it was all being set up, okay? The stage was set for a Mephisto appearance. This didn't just come out of nowhere. And not only did the comic book context support these theories, but also we got a few hints, we got a few references that led us in that direction as well. For example, the now infamous quote from Agnes where she says the devil is in the details, or when you hear Quicksilver or Fietro call Wanda's children demon spawn, when he refers to Wanda's version of Westview as nice as hell. Like, people were hanging on to every single reference to hell, to the devil, to demons, okay, because they could all be references to the comics and to Mephisto's role in Wanda's story. But I guess that Those were just all red herrings. Like, that's really brave. I'm so sorry. I don't know if it's a case where, you know, no one at Marvel, maybe Jack Schaefer or her team, didn't even realize that there would be that Mephisto connection when they were writing the script. I don't know if it's the case where they intentionally left it there and left them as red herrings for people. We'll talk about that in a second as well. I don't know what the case was, but either way, there was enough evidence presented that the idea of Mephisto's involvement in this whole thing, him being the big bad behind it all, was plausible. And in fact, my theory was that there was a 3-tier system of power within the Hex, where you had, of course, at the bottom, the Westview residents, but then you also had Wanda, who was able to control them. But then at the very top, you had someone like Mephisto, or even Nightmare. We'll talk about Nightmare in a second, or even the Grim Reaper for some reason. Again, we'll talk about that in a second, but they would ultimately be the big bad, okay? The big bads that would be revealed near the end of the series. And somewhere between Wanda and the big bad, Agatha would be there as a kind of liaison, someone who was working for the big bad, but ensuring that Wanda remained comfortable, remained taken care of, so that she wouldn't leave the control of this ultimate big bad, so that they could siphon her powers for themselves. And actually, if I'm being honest, that to me makes perfect sense. Like, that storyline makes absolute sense to me. And also the idea that, you know, Mephisto would require Wanda's powers in order to be released from maybe literal hell, like literal hell, or whatever dimension he exists in, perhaps the dark dimension, I don't know. But it would make sense then for him to have the motivation to keep Wanda in the Hex and keep her brainwashed so that she can live this idyllic life with Vision. Meanwhile, he's sucking out her powers. And in fact, that is supported by one of the ads that we got in the series. Of course, the ad with the shark and the Yo Magic yogurt. I think that would have tied in perfectly. Although, of course, now we realize that the shark was most likely just Agnes wanting to suck Wanda's power out. But I feel like in that version of events, we don't really see the motivations that Agnes has. We don't really see why she wanted to take control of Wanda's powers, other than she's the big bad and she wants it because it's shiny and powerful. Like, we don't really get much of a motivation in comparison to if it was Mephisto who was stuck in, you know, a hell dimension and he needed to get out, and in order to do so, he needed Wanda's powers. Okay, so let's quickly touch on Nightmare, because he also became a runner-up for the big bad of the series. And the main reason why, I believe, is because he is perhaps speculated to be involved in Doctor Strange 2. He is traditionally a Doctor Strange villain, so people thought maybe because Wanda is going to be involved in Doctor Strange 2, we would see the appearance of Nightmare in the series. So people did suspect as well that it could be Nightmare, or indeed it could be the Grim Reaper. This was kind of out of left field. I'm not quite sure about the links between the Grim Reaper and, you know, Wanda and, you know, Vision's storyline in the comics, but this was an explicit clue. This was an explicit clue from the show, because the show had a reference to the Grim Reaper, a pretty explicit reference in episode 2 during the Bewitched styled opening sequence where Vision is off to work and he phases through the floor and therefore the ceiling, and in between we can see the Grim Reaper helmet. So that kind of that didn't end up being anything. I don't know why they included that in there. Maybe we will see the payoff to that in a few films time, who knows. And speaking of red herrings, this was the biggest one. I'm so sorry, like, this is not even up for debate. This was the biggest red herring of the whole show. Of course I'm talking about FIETRO. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, but who the hell do they think they are? Who the hell do they think they are? Seriously? What I already talked about in my review of episode 9, how much of a waste it was to have Evan Peters on the show for him to end up being no one. Like, how much of a waste is it? Marvel needs to stop doing this, wasting these excellent actors. They've done it before with another excellent actor in Iron Man 3, Sir Ben Kingsley himself, where he ended up being another actor. I've already talked about this at length, but that is so frustrating to me. But in terms of the theories, surrounding Quicksilver, that's an even bigger shame, because seriously, I feel like the storylines we came up with surrounding this character were far more interesting, quite frankly. So first of all, there was an idea that he was perhaps Mephisto himself. Now this definitely made sense, especially because of the time that he actually makes an appearance, which is when Wanda and Vision are having an argument and Wanda is starting to question things a little bit, and all of a sudden he makes this sudden appearance as Wanda's brother, as a sort of way to kind of calm her and bring her back down, back under the influence of the hex. So it makes sense then if it was someone who was in control of the hex, someone who had a vested interest in ensuring that Wanda remained under the hex's control and under their influence. But the preferred theory that I had about Quicksilver's involvement was that he was in fact the Fox's X-Men iteration of the character, who had been taken from an alternate dimension by whoever was in charge of the hex, and he had been subbed in for Wanda's version of Pietro, because of course Pietro had already died and it had already been established, you know, using Sparky, R.I.P. Sparky, it had already been established that Wanda could not bring the dead back to life, so a substitute needed to be used. Again, I feel like that makes sense to me. I feel like that makes sense. I feel like it's a much better storyline than what we got for Fietro. The alternatives were just so much better. Like, it's honestly kind of, it's awkward. Like, it's kind of embarrassing, if I'm being honest. Another red herring that a lot of people latched onto was, of course, that of Dottie and the theory that she could be Mephisto herself. Now, I personally never subscribed to this theory, okay? You guys did, I didn't, okay? I didn't really think that she would be Mephisto, but I thought it was possible based on the justifications that people had, the idea that, you know, Agatha or Agnes at that time established that she was the leader of the town, that she was in charge, that if you wanted anything done, you'd have to go through her, including school admissions, when she was still trying to convince Wanda to have children. We'll get to that in a second too. But it was very much set up that Dottie was this kind of key character, the it girl of the town. And so it would have been a cool twist that she ended up being Mephisto, or someone who was in charge of all of this. It would have made sense. The thing is about a lot of these theories is that they make sense because of what is both in the comics and also in the show itself, and people just going through the series with a fine-tooth comb. Many of these theories aren't actually that far-fetched, and I think that's where a lot of the disappointment stems from, is the idea that it was right there. It was literally right there and the writers didn't go for the bait. Okay, so now let's talk about the big cameo. Now this one's a little bit different because it wasn't explicitly hinted at in the series itself, and of course there's no real precedent for it in the comics. Literally anyone could have shown up, but this was mostly a theory that kind of popped up as a result of the press tour, you know, the press that was happening around the series and people interviewing the actors. And someone did interview Elizabeth Olsen and ask her if there was going to be a Luke Skywalker level cameo in WandaVision. Now this is in reference to Luke Skywalker, spoiler alert, showing up at the end of The Mandalorian season 2 in one of the biggest reveals in a very long time that was very impressively done and kept secret. Now people were asking Elizabeth if something similar was going to happen in WandaVision, but many have since said that she likely didn't even see The Mandalorian, so she didn't realize what they were referencing, and she never explicitly said that that was the case either. She said that there were surprises in store, but that's it. Like, she never promised a big Luke Skywalker cameo situation. So a lot of that came from fans, you know, taking her on her single word and running with it, like literally sprinting with it. So that wasn't really her fault. But the second one was definitely their fault, because then you also had Paul Bettany being asked about the same thing, whether there would be a major cameo. And to be fair, he did say that Doctor Strange would not be making an appearance on the show, although there was a chance that he was lying, because he's a liar. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. But he did explicitly say that he would not be making an appearance on the show. I watched the interview myself, so I can vouch for that. But he also had the cheek to say that the big cameo of the finale would be an actor that he'd been wanting to work with for a very long time. An actor that he admired, an actor that, you know, he was really excited to get into these really intense scenes with. And ultimately, who was that actor? himself. It was just him. He fooled us all, and people started to kind of clock onto this a few days ago actually, so I'm very impressed by those who had the creativity and imagination to think that maybe he was just talking about himself. But yeah, I mean, next up, let's talk about some of these ads. Now, this series was very creative in the way that it utilized advertising or commercials within the sitcom genre. However, I will say that I was slightly disappointed by the fact that nothing really came of the ads themselves. Ultimately, my first guess for what the ads were was correct. They did ultimately symbolize or represent Wanda's past traumas in her life. We saw this through the first ad with the Stark toaster and of course the Hydra watch, and then again so on and so forth with the Lagos paper towels and, you know, cleaning up messes that you didn't intend to make. So I was right on that front, which, you know, pat on the back for me, I guess. Although some people went one step further and did have the additional theory that these ads represented each Infinity Stone. So the first ad, which had, you know, a massive red dot in the middle of the toaster that bared resemblance to Vision, according to some. Listen, it wasn't it wasn't me on this one, okay? But they believed that to be a reference to the Mind Stone, even though it was red, but you know, whatever. And then some people thought that, of course, the Hydra watch would be a reference to the Time Stone. I think the Lagos paper towel one was supposed to be a reference to Reality Stone and the ether, and that's where the red comes from, although I thought the red was just spilt blood. But I guess there could have been a double entendre there, maybe, if you squint. But that started to kind of fall apart a little bit, to be fair, so I don't think that theory was ever really strong and prevailing. And speaking of the sitcom genre being used as a storytelling device in this series, another theory that was proven correct was the theory that Wanda had used the sitcom genre as inspiration from her experience watching it in Sokovia as she was growing up. That's something that I mentioned in one of my earlier reviews, and that did of course manifest in episode 8, where we saw Wanda's backstory and how she used to love sitcoms and used to love watching them with her family in Sokovia. And when times got really rough for her, whether it was in Sokovia with the war happening right outside of their door, or of course when she was taken by Hydra and she was experimented on, she always used sitcoms as a sort of safe haven, as a form of escapism from her traumas and from her struggles. And so it made sense then that she would use the sitcom genre as a kind of set up for her entire imaginary world that she created in order to live with Vision in happy bliss. Now, another theory that seemed to have pissed off a lot of people when it was disproven was surrounding the identity of Monica's contact. I think it was aerospace engineer or something like that. The scientist who was supposed to come over and help Monica re-enter the hex after she'd been through it already twice and it was already starting to affect her DNA. Well, this contact was much speculated on, okay? People had all of these predictions and these theories for who it could be. The main one, of course, being that it was Reed Richards and it would be an introduction to the Fantastic Four. I personally never really subscribed to that theory. I felt like it was a bit of a jump to already introduce the Fantastic Four, especially because in my mind the Fantastic Four exists in a very separate place, which we'll talk about in a second. But I was shocked to see that that contact ended up being like a random a random woman. Like, Marvel, like, who do you think you are? Kevin Feige knows, okay? Kevin Feige knows how fans react. He's been doing this for over 10 years now. He had to have known. And again, the whole plot twist thing, the whole red herring thing, like, he's done that. Iron Man 3 was already a thing and people hated that aspect of that film. So why do this again? And finally, in terms of theories and predictions that people had surrounding the show, let's talk about the children for a second here, because the role that they played in the series was actually far less complex, far less interesting, and far less significant, at least in terms of the plot surrounding, you know, Wanda and the villain of the show, than people predicted. Because as I mentioned, people did think that Mephisto would somehow be involved in the show, and that of course stems from the comics, where the kids are parts of his soul. They're shards of his soul, and in order for him to come back and to exist in the realm of the living, he would have to, I guess, take control of those kids once again, and that could perhaps be a motivation for Agnes trying to convince Wanda to have kids in the first place, because she would know somehow that they would end up being shards of Mephisto's soul, because perhaps they're, you know, made in the hex, so whatever's created in the hex would be parts of Mephisto's soul, and they would be brought to life by Wanda, and maybe that would also help bring him to life. Like, maybe you can explain it that way, I don't know. But people thought that the kids' involvement very much pointed towards there being a Mephisto storyline coming up, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. But that ultimately also meant that there was no reason why Agatha would try to persuade Wanda to have kids in the first place. Why did she want her to have kids? Because it is a major factor in the first few episodes where the town is trying to convince her to have children. But first of all, it's revealed that the town is under the full control of Wanda. So is she trying to convince herself to have children in that case? Or two, even if Agatha does manage to get control of the town in that way and convinces Wanda to have children through the town, then why? Why is that the case? Like, what significance would the children serve to Agatha? Perhaps only to keep Wanda in the dome for as long as possible and to keep her kind of compliant for as long as possible, whilst Agatha tries to figure out who she is and how she could get her magic. But that's not really explained, that's not really explored in the series, so I felt like ultimately the kids' involvement was kind of wasted. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on all of the theories and the predictions, what we got right and what we got wrong, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of all of this down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!